Yes, viewers. So, over the last couple of days, we were very consumed in the media space with what's been happening with Caribbean Airlines because, of course, it's part of our lifeline, if you want to say it as that, to Trinidad, because of how much we depend on Trinidad for so many things. But we're putting a pause on that conversation just a little bit. And we're going to be talking about some things that are happening within the space, especially politically. And joining us right now, we have economist Dr. Vanus James on with us. Good morning and welcome to you, sir. How are you?
Morning, Kandace. How are you?
I am great. So, on a couple of weeks ago, or last week, I should say, last week Sunday, we had the launch of the TPP, the Tobago People's Party. Just on the onset, what are your opinions about the launch of the party, the formation, moving from independence and before from PDP members to now TPP?
Well, when you're evaluating political organizations of any kind, new or old, you have to look at what they stand for, and what their record is the most basic way in which you make that evaluation. So, if you ask me, the issue that I would put on the table is, let's go back and look at the record. Uh, Much of this, minus Watson Duke, is the PDP in new clothing, so to say. And you can evaluate what the public thinks about the Watson half of the PDP by what happened in the local government elections in Trinidad. Yeah? And I think if you look at the record in Tobago, the dismal performance you saw down there is very likely to be repeated here by this half, unless some sort of miracle occurs in the political space between now and the next election.
Mm-hmm. So we're seeing that, Watson Duke is basically saying that Fally Augustine, Chief Secretary Fally Augustine, and the rest of them hijacked the party, and the new formation of the TPP is the same faces. So, but you're saying that without Watson Duke, they're not going to make the same impact that they made in 2021.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying the public's evaluation of Watson Duke's half of the party is clear from his dismal failure in the local government elections in Trinidad. Because what people do in politics, normal citizens, is they evaluate you on your performance. And if you destroyed the PDP that you took to the people and made these grand offers of fundamentally important change, and you didn't keep them, you didn't keep the party together, the people would punish you. That's what happened to Watson in Trinidad. Now you have to ask what would happen to the other half of the party. This TPP is just the other half of the PDP. And you have to look at their record, right? The same way. First of all, in political terms, you have to look at what happened within the PDP, why you ended up with this split and this breakup. And if the public holds them responsible for some of that, they'll pay the price in the next election. Should the public hold them responsible? Fundamentally, the answer is yes, of course. You can't just hold Watson alone responsible. You have to pay attention to the fact that they were part of the promise to the people of Tobago to do some fundamental things, and they had the power in their hands to do those things. The most important of those is the pursuit of autonomy. Between December 2021 and now, nothing has been done on that. Tied to autonomy is the central question of the inclusion of the people of Tobago in the governance process. That is the key to institutional progress that would drive economic development in Tobago. In the absence of that, you can't have any economic development. We have ample evidence of that around the world.
Yes.
So, after they broke with Watson, they had the power in their hands. They didn't do it before April. After April, essentially the breakup came. And after April, they were in power and had the opportunity to put in place for the people to see how you would keep the promise of empowerment. Between then and now, nothing has been done on that. And the team became notorious for shutting off their phones and nobody can get access to them. So the public will not forget those things and they will be evaluated on that for their political performance. So up to now, no movement has been made to deal with the issue of autonomy. And a lot of that has to do with all of this airline stuff. The absence of an appropriate approach to the dialogue with Port of Spain that would allow us to shape and influence and lead the way policy is formed with respect to Tobago down there. The absence of that kind of leadership is at the heart of why we can't have a real conversation with Caribbean Airlines about how to fix the service. Now, if you don't prosecute autonomy on that kind of front, leading Trinidad, leading the government down there, that's Tobago's responsibility. If you look at what has been done, the people would see and they will hold you responsible because they will notice, for example, in the last budget, the THA fairly allocated $6 million to pursue autonomy. But the morning after that, he declared war on Rowley. Now, once you declare war on Rowley, that's the end of, that's a wasted $6 million. That's the end of any talk about autonomy.
And I'm going to stick a pin right there with that declaration of war because that was the messaging that came very clearly from the launch last Sunday.
Absolutely.
That it's a war now between, well, Tobago and the central government.
So that means that as long as Rowley is Prime Minister, you're not going to get any autonomy. Let me remind the public of how you will win autonomy from Port of Spain. You can't simply pursue the old Robinsonian agenda, right? What you have to do is now say, we've gone as far as we can with the agenda of internal self-government. What we need now is an agenda to provide the THA with lawmaking capacity, the primary reason for which would be to control and manage the operations of the Executive Council. In other words, you will need a type of THA that could make law to restrict and restrain and instruct the behavior of the Executive Council, evaluate it, and so on. That's the essence of autonomy. So it's not a break with Trinidad. It's a reorganization of the THA with the power in the THA to make law, to encase policy. Now, the public will understand that because people like myself will participate in that conversation.
Very thoroughly.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And when the public understands that that is really what we're talking about when we talk about autonomy, and they look at the war, they will see you have no chance of moving that agenda forward because you don't have anybody to talk to in Trinidad. You're not talking to the PNM. You're not talking to Rowley. Rowley even say he ain't even want to talk to Farley unless he had 3-4 people in the meeting because he can't trust Farley. When you have that breakdown, let me remind the public of something. The way we got the Dispute Resolution Commission to work is that we went to Pandy and offered him leadership. We didn't go begging. We went as competent professionals and we laid out why you have to trigger this thing, how it has to work, and we even had a deal with Pandy that at the end of the dispute resolution case, if we win, we would move immediately to constitutional reform to deal with these issues that we're talking about today. So you have to lead the government in Trinidad. Declaring war amounts to saying, well, okay, we're going to secede because we can't get it through you. And God bless you if that's your agenda for Tobago. Tobagonians are much smarter than that because they know that we can only fund about 20%, and under this government, now 18% of our government's needs, to say nothing of the economy's needs. So you could leave this secession agenda to one side, and you have to deal with the tough task of offering competent leadership to Port of Spain to prosecute the national development agenda, by empowering Tobago to do the things we need to do to fix our economy here.
Now, what does that competent leadership look like? And do you see any elements of it within this present administration?
That's what I'm saying to you. That well, we have another half of the record I will tell you about in a minute.
Okay.
But the competent leadership goes to one critical fact. If you look at the THA Act, what it really amounts to is an assignment to the people of Tobago, full responsibility to manage our economy. The fifth schedule is essentially the description of the economy of Tobago. And the 25(1) of the THA Act says you could make policy in order to deal with that economic story. Now, if you look at the Local Government Act that was just passed in the Parliament, you would see very clearly that is a big difference between local government in Trinidad and in Tobago. The local government bodies in Trinidad are required by the law to follow the policies of the government in Port of Spain. 25(1) of the THA Act says you make policy. If the central government has a policy and your policy conflict with it, we go have to sort that out. But fundamentally, you have the right to make policy and implement it to sort out your fifth schedule responsibilities. Now, Hocho Charles continually explains to Tobagonians that you can't make policy that is not encased in law. So what you have to do to pursue the matter of autonomy is lead the government in Trinidad to understand that if we want to develop the economy of Tobago and bring Tobago to play a rightful place, an appropriate place, an adequate place in the development of the country, we need the room in the law to make law relevant to the fifth schedule activities in order to encase policy. And encasing policy just means here are the parameters for the executive council to follow. You can't just make law. You make law within the framework the THA sets, legal framework we set. So you could say only this far your policies could go. The law will restrict you in that sense.
All right.
So
Well,
you follow what I'm saying?
yes,
Good.
certainly. And we're going to get more into that conversation when we come back after the break. So viewers, please don't go anywhere.
Good morning, Tobago.
Welcome back to Good Morning Tobago on Tobago Updates. Viewers, we are continuing our conversation this morning with economist Dr. Vanus James. Now, before we went to the break, we were speaking a little bit about how should we treat with autonomy, because there's a whole lot of issues within this space that have raised the question quite a lot, right? I mean, we have more of the population, it seems, talking about the need for autonomy and so on. And Dr. James is saying that it has to be within the construct of a law versus what we're seeing or hearing
The
from...
power to make law.
Yes.
That's the central
Instead of
issue.
the declaration of war stance that
Exactly.
we're hearing from the TPP leaders and the chief secretary and the team. Now, could you elaborate a little bit on how that should look within? Yeah.
How do you lead government in Trinidad?
Yes.
So what you have to do, and what we promised the people of Tobago would be done, is you would immediately set up your operations in Tobago according to the law. Now, the THA Act provides you room by saying, take all such steps as are required to do your job. So you could set up the inclusion arrangements, including arrangements to include Trinidadians in the conversation, include the central government in the conversation, and so on. You could set up the arrangements so that you could signal to Trinidadians and to the government in Trinidad what your intention is. And then you say, this is how we really want to do it, but we don't have enough room in the law. So we need autonomy. We need us to change the law so that we could have the power to make this signal into the structure that we are calling THA, good governance, inclusive governance, and so on. Between January and now, Farley's government has essentially refused to reorganize the THA in a way to set up the operations to show how you would bring the people of Tobago in. And what the government has been doing is going around and holding what they call in town hall meetings, but that is nowhere near what you need if you're going to reorganize. You can't reorganize the THA around town hall meetings. You have to reorganize the THA's work around appropriate oversight committees. And even if you can't set them up with the power of oversight that is required in full law, you do whatever you can up front, and you say to Rowley, look, you see how we're going about it? This is what you need. This is what you even need in Trinidad. But we need power in law to do this fully inside the THA. My recommendation to them was set up the advisory committees, which would essentially become the oversight committees of a well-organized THA. They haven't done that. Tobagonians will remember that in the entire campaign to take the government, that was the essential promise. And you don't keep it after 2 years, nothing you say about forming party will signal to them you're doing that. What people will say, and what people are saying to me already, is these guys are just looking after themselves. They're not looking after us. Now, once people make the judgment that that's what you're about, you will get the Watson treatment from the local government elections. So that's the first half. But a much more important thing that must stay at the top of mind of the team that has set up this party is that people will think governance in a very broad way, but they will feel the economy in their pockets. And they know that the law gives you responsibility to manage the economy. And they look at your record. And if you look at the record of this team last year and up to now, inclusive, remember, people will hold you accountable, inclusive of any collapse, any further collapse that takes place here in 2023. 2022 was a massive collapse of the Tobago economy. Even the THA experienced a 7% decline in output. When you're talking about output decline, you're not talking about money spent. You're talking about you're growing planting. Last year you produced 1 planting. This year you produced 2. That's what we're talking about.
So in other words, productivity
real
stopped.
output. Yeah, productivity goes up or something like that. That causes it. Last year, 2022, after the PNM that we removed had pushed the economy out of COVID from $1.61 billion of output to $1.68 billion worth of output. Under Farley's first year, the economy fell back to 1.65. That's a 2% decline. Now, there's a broad-based set of declines underneath that. Construction, after Farley's war on the construction sector, construction declined by 35%. We gave Farley's government the quarry to run. The quarry declined by 35%. The quarry alone declined in output by 35%. All of these are signals of mismanagement and incompetence and a lack of capacity to lead. Agriculture, where we talk a lot about food security in the very first year of Farley's government, food security, and so on. Agriculture declined by 9.5%. And within that, egg production declined by 38%. Our famous small ruminants, goat and sheep, declined by 19%. And I've been going around to farmers trying to find out, well, why would that happen? And the farmers told me competition from Venezuelan sheep. And they experienced it in Trinidad as well.
Yeah.
That requires leadership of the central government to understand the facts on the ground here and to help make policy to forestall that. Nothing was done. 19% decline. Fruits and vegetables in Tobago, 39% decline. So if you, and then where else? In the banking sector, 2.7% decline. Now, when that happens in banking, you know what the reason is for that. That is banks withdraw credit, right? As Tobago businesses have been complaining about it. Banks withdraw credit. So the flow of credit services to businesses has fallen. Now, all of that has taken place in 2022, Farley's first year. Now, people will not forget that. Just before you come in, let me just tell you one last piece of data.
All right.
The CSO's data. This is THA data I'm giving you. But the CSO's data shows you that real household incomes in Tobago fell 6% in 2022. And poor people, the poorer half of Tobago, 8.5%. Now, look, these people are feeling these things in their pockets. I've never gotten more requests for help from me and my business in Tobago than last year, running into this year, from Tobagonians. And that tells you they're feeling it in their pocket. They will not forget that when they're evaluating Farley's government. They will say, you're looking after yourself, we're in trouble. And if you call an election, they will have the same experience that Watson got in Port of Spain, believe me, as a scientist.
Well, when you look at the figures, it's one thing, we're seeing all the declines, as you mentioned, in the various sectors and so on. But is that also taken into context all the external factors that are affecting it? You have COVID-19, we have businesses that were still struggling from the sea bridge issues. We have a decline in tourism numbers. Caribbean Airlines is a part of this whole problem with not giving us enough flights, discouraging people from coming here because people are choosing to go elsewhere because it's so difficult to get to Tobago. And with just 60,000 people on the island, it's difficult for business to thrive. We depend on the additional people to have a successful business. So then, if you put all those things, the global factors, all of that into context, is it fair to say that Mr. Augustine handled the economy badly?
Well, you can. The people will know, no? The business people will know. The business people will know that COVID had nothing to do with the decline of the construction sector. Won't they know? They will know, for example, that it was Farley's religious war against the construction sector that shut it down and created the 35% decline. And business people will also know that it has nothing to do with the 35% decline in the quarry. That's just gross mismanagement. You can't say external factors cause that. If you can't get your products, say, to market because you don't have an export license, then you look around in Tobago and find business people who might have export licenses and you work with them. But you can't know they have it unless you have a real conversation that is open to them. You can't know that by looking off your phone. You have to set up the conversation in the way I'm talking about it. So you could know from businesses what the possibilities are. You can't blame international forces for that. But let me give you the piece of data that tells you this has nothing to do with COVID. In 2020, when the PNM was running Tobago, COVID came. Mm-hmm. And the economy declined sharply to 1.61 billion. In 2021, when we began the exit from COVID, the PNM that we removed from office moved the economy within the dregs of COVID from 1.61 to 1.68. So if they're able to do it with their terrible policies, why would Farley cause a decline to 1.65? You can't blame COVID for that. It makes no sense to blame COVID for that. And it also makes no sense to blame international factors because Trinidad and Tobago's economy in the same period was growing, right? Moody's said we have a positive outlook. The IMF said we're doing okay, we're growing by 1.2%. Why would Tobago then decline by 2%? You can't blame international forces for that. That has to do with the way you manage the economy here in Tobago. And the key to that way you manage is leadership of policy making, properly by first conversing properly with the government in Trinidad, and secondly by having a real active conversation going with the business community in Tobago. And that conversation could only be properly constituted when you, the executive, are having a relatively independent team engaging with the business community so they could bring the evidence and lay it before you and say, well, this is what we think, this is what we think you should do, these are the facts, and so on. Conversations with the banking sector. In 2022, when the commercial banks were declining by 2.7%, credit unions were growing by 7.8%. Right? Now, what does that tell you? Credit unions have the features, the basic features of a development bank. What you really ought to have done is to engage with the business community and the governments in Trinidad in order to work out the parameters for establishing a Tobago-based national development bank. That would then prevent the decline in the financial services that you saw in 2022. But this government locked itself away from the rest of us and did nothing about that. So at the end of the day, after 18 months in office, we are still without a development plan. We're still without a development bank. We're still without the parameters for setting it up. And so 2023, we're into August now. Nothing has been done to deal with the crisis of 2022. And you're going to have, especially with this Caribbean Airlines fallout here now, that's an external force, but it's an internal force if you think about your own responsibility and your leadership and the way you have to engage the conversation with Caribbean Airlines so you don't have to rely purely on the central government subsidy of the travel costs. You could say under the THA Act, you could say, look, the central government is putting $400 per trip. We're going to add 200 out of our budget. So you can't say the flights are not commercially viable. You have the right to intervene if that is critical to the development of the tourism sector. But sitting there and just grumbling about what the central government is doing and declaring war against them and then grumbling about the Caribbean Airlines without bringing forward proper competent leadership, people will know that partly because people like me will make it clear you can't just govern as though you're running your own house. And let me just give the people of Tobago one last piece of evidence around this. I am not a man who does go and preach in the churches like Farley does. But one guy came to my house last Sunday and he said to me, next time you go on television, tell Tobagonians, Jeremiah said, he's a church man now, so he quoted the Bible, the most basic requirement of a good leader is honesty. And Farley is suspect on that matter for this reason. Not because I all Rowley say and everybody else say. The evidence is there. Farley knew that the economy was in collapse when he presented the budget. His team presented the data I gave you. The CSO had already given me that data before the budget was published. Up to now, even though I went public with the data, up to now, Farley and his government has said nothing to the people of Tobago about that state of crisis and nothing about what would be done to deal with it. That's dishonesty. And that, for me, when you weigh that in the scales, the political fallout from that will be, you go to the polls for the general election, this team, they can't beat even the PNM. I say even. And if you go with the THA election, you can't beat the PNM. We're going to have to beat the PNM with a different approach to government that brings the people of Tobago fully into the process.
So then where does it leave us politically? Because if you have people that are not satisfied with what the PNM did over the last 20 years, and they're not satisfied with what Mr. Augustine has been doing over the last couple of years, then what is the option?
It is the normal responsibility of society. Every society, you look everywhere. If you look in Britain, as I always point out, last year, you would see it was the Conservative Party, not the Labour Party, that removed Boris Johnson for breaking the law and removed Liz Truss for incompetence. If we had set up the government properly in Tobago so that the party in power would have a majority of non-executive persons, not in the executive council, who could evaluate the work of the executive council and say, look, this team is not competent. We're going to move them. Then what we would have is a quick strike. Within 4 or 5 months, they show they don't know what they're doing. The majority party in the House will remove them. That's what happened to Boris Johnson. That's what happened to Liz Truss. Since we don't have that design, we have to wait till the next election. Well, what the people of Tobago need to do now is demand, politically, of course, through all of the regular media calls and all the other things, that we change the way the THA is designed. We have to reform the THA so that the structure allows us to discipline the executive council and not allow for either the incompetence or the excesses that we are seeing. I mean, this is easily the worst government we've put in power since 1980. Easily. I mean, this business of getting in trouble with the law and all that sort of stuff. You've never seen a government like that. People will not forget those things. So to move forward, we have to set up the THA differently so it could hold the executive council to account. As it is now, Farley could hold the secretaries to account, but nobody could hold him to account unless we go to an election. But you saw that good governance would allow us, like in the British case, to remove the chief secretary if he begins to display evidence by oversight mechanism we detect that he is causing trouble for Tobago that we can't tolerate. That has to be dealt with by changing the structure of the THA. And that's the essence of the fight for autonomy. And if we can't wait on Farley, all the rest of us have to get up and clamor for autonomy so we could set up our government properly to work the way we want it to work.
All right. Well, we're going to put a pause there on the conversation because we got to take a quick break. But viewers, please don't go anywhere because we'll be continuing with Dr. Vanus James when we return.
Come on over. Yeah. Hey. Tobago updates. Na, 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 na. Good morning, Tobago.
Welcome back to Good Morning Tobago on Tobago Updates. Viewers, we are continuing our conversations this morning with economist Dr. Vanus James as we take a look at what's been going on politically within our space. And we know, of course, how closely tied economy is with politics. Part of how we can excel within our space is that whole question of autonomy. We spent quite a bit of this hour speaking about that. But it's a conversation that I think some of us here in Tobago are also getting tired of because it's happening the same way over and over and over again. We all understand we need greater autonomy, but all the efforts that have gone before have proved futile. So then,
well,
what now?
I am not tired, and I'm an old man, and I don't think young people ought to be tired either. One of the things people have to know in a place like Tobago is development is difficult business. Remember, it's 3 things we have to get right simultaneously. We have to learn how to set up our government and our institutions properly. The government makes plans and policies and so on. That has to be set up properly to allow them to do that right. And doing correct policies and plans is all about the way you bring the people in. So remember in this business, good policy doesn't mean scientific policy alone. It also means policies the people agree with via the mechanisms of participation you make available to them. That's one of the reasons I've been trying to pound into the heads of all of these guys. That inclusive government rather than town hall meetings is the way you're going to help Tobago. Town hall meetings might put you in power, but it won't get you development.
And what specific part of, inclusive government? Like, what's an example of that exclusive government that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, all right. The business of the information that makes government work well is at the heart of this conversation. Right now, the way the THA makes policy is to rely fundamentally on the public servants. And the public servants essentially are set up there to do science, to use statistics and scientific research and agricultural research and stuff like that, and come up with a way to judge where we have to go. That's the way it's done. But if you look in the US or even in Britain or in Finland, for example, a very beautiful case, what you will see is that there's a second set of information that really allows you to get policy right. And I can explain it in a simple way. When I go out and do a survey, I go with a form and I have a very restrictive framework in which businesses could give me information, right? We're currently doing that kind of survey on the fisheries industry for Shell. Now, we know we'll get a limited frame of information, but you need another type of information. When you go to a businessman and you say, well, what is it you're doing? The businessman don't just fill out a form. He give you details about what he's trying to do and why it would work. That set of details from everybody is what the good governance arrangements really allow you to collect. When you set up the government in such a way that you could call everybody in to the government and gather the data, right, from them as to what they mean, what they're trying, what they're willing to do in detail. That is the critical piece of data that allows you to complement what the public servants bring and make good judgment. So you have to set up your government to get the kind of information you need in order to get sound policy made, right? The thing about us is we can't forget, you can't take development for granted in Tobago. If you don't make good policy, you can't get development in Tobago. So you've got to have a proper way to get good policy made. And that's what inclusive government is all about. And that inclusive government inside the THA means it's not policy made by the Executive Council, instructed by the public service. It is a good policy made by the legislature, good law made by the legislature, having heard from the people properly, to restrict and constrain and contain the policies that the Executive Council and the public service would want to make. So that framework is what we have to put in place here. Otherwise, Tobago has no chance to develop.
Now, Dr. James, I know that you're someone that's quite on the ground and you have been collecting data and so on your own. So from some of the data that you've collected, what do you think is one of those policies that we need to put in place?
Well, apart from what I'm saying there about,
yes,
yeah, because much of it you get from the actual
Let's say in terms of agriculture, right? What is one of those policies that we need in agriculture to take it forward?
All right. The way I would understand agriculture is essentially this. It is part of our effort to look after ourselves internally,
yes,
to provision ourselves. That's the whole idea behind food security. The evidence we have from all the studies we've done as economists around the world, to say nothing of what I and others have been doing in the region, is that that means productivity growth in agriculture. And to get productivity growth in agriculture in a place like Tobago, with all the terrible terrain and all that sort of stuff that we're working with, you have to be looking first and foremost at elaborate training of your farmers to work with modern technologies that they can pick from among all the options that are available. They won't have access to tractors, for example. You can't go too far with that in the terrain we have. But they will have access to other things, varieties, fertilizers, a whole range of other things. And if they are knowingly doing what they're doing, if they are trained properly, long ago we used to have an extension service. I grew up learning agriculture from the extension officer that used to come on my father's farm. That's where you get a big step. But you have to train your farmers. We had off-farm school and all those kinds of things. What it all comes down to is high-tech farming. High-tech farming, I went to see an engineer the other day who was explaining to me how to set up the aquaculture. And this is an engineer who switched to doing agriculture using these technologies. And she was showing me, well, this is how you do it, that is how you do it. That's a big learning experience. I plan to try it. My point is, that's the kind of learning that has to be going on all the time for something like agriculture. And then, of course, post-harvest handling of foods. Tobago is a small place, so if you raise productivity in agriculture, you have to be producing the things in a way that allows you to export some of it. So if you're exporting eggs, you're not in business. But if you're exporting stuff made from eggs, then what you have is a real chance to export that to Trinidad and maybe the rest of the region and the rest of the world to get value added at a high rate in Tobago's agriculture. That's the kind of thing we have to be talking about.
So in
And
other
you can't
words-
get that unless you're talking to your farmers.
So in other words, you think that we should focus in terms of agriculture, in terms of export of agriculture, should focus on the value-added products.
High-tech farming and whatever the farmers and the industrialists are saying is possible. Not low-tech farming of the kind that I do. I mean, I did a first degree, half of which was agricultural economics. I grew up in agriculture, and I could tell you, I can't farm on a scale and in a way that is required for me to live on farming. So you've got to get that process right. And that is not just true for agriculture. In services, for example, including tourism services, the biggest thing you have to think about is if you're going to thrive in the modern world, you have to be producing not just season and sand tourism and even single events tourism. You kind of have to do, what Tobago is trying is just like what Jamaica is trying. And what Jamaica has gotten from that approach to tourism is $5,600 per person per year. If you look at what the Cayman Islands tried, you will see how to get 90,000. Trinidad and Tobago get 19,000 from oil and gas. Cayman Islands without oil and gas, 90,000. Bermuda, without oil and gas, 115,000. How is that possible? Because they follow a central principle of development economics, which is what you have to specialize in is making what we call capital output. So in other words, in the case of Tobago, instead of exporting season and sand and feta and stuff like that, that too, you do that too. Anchor. You have to enter into high quality exportable capital services like education. And you have to team up with the world to do it. That's what the Cayman Islands did with their financial services. They brought the whole world in, PwC, all of these big firms. And their tourism caters to that. And so what they do is, instead of having Marriott build hotels, 80% of their room stock is 10 rooms or less, A class, $150 a night. Lawyers could come in for 6 months and use that kind of facility. That's the kind of way you have. But you need to have a conversation with the society and the world in order to craft that, because Tobago can't make any progress on any of these fronts alone, with the people we have here alone. You have to move in the direction of a real conversation with everybody so that people, Tobagonians abroad, business people who want to come, all of them could help you to frame what is to be done. And there's a critical part to that that goes to why you need autonomy. That ain't possible unless you have a real entrepreneurial development program in Tobago, where you make it possible for good and young entrepreneurs coming from all around the world to locate here. That means you have to set the policy framework to attract them, to make them get access to citizenship and all those kinds of things in order to come here and set up the operations. Tobago has to become the best place for them to operate.
So in other words, you're saying we should adopt, I can't remember the name of what it's called, but I know a lot of the other Caribbean islands have it.
Citizen by investment. Exactly.
So that's what we need here.
Something like that. But I know their programs, and I would do Tobago's programs a little differently. The way you choose, however, to do it ultimately comes down to the kind of conversation you have with the potential investors. They'll tell you what they really need. So good governance is the heart of the necessary basis on which you could get this kind of 134-year-old problem that we have here to be sorted out. If you don't have the good governance thing right, you can't get the innovation right, you can't get the economic restructuring right, and you can't get those right, you can't get development. So this is a critical thing that tells Tobagonians we're wasting time the way we're going now. We have to change our approach, and the first step is good governance to hear from everybody. And that ain't town meetings, that ain't town hall meetings.
It goes beyond.
That's about internal arrangements in the THA. I don't know why that is such a hard thing. The science tells you that. I'm not sure other than the taste for dictatorship and the taste for authoritarian behavior, I'm not sure why we missed the opportunity we missed when we removed the PNM. The PNM has said they don't want to change the rules. They didn't want to do any serious development planning with us, so they bring experts from outside. When Fali and them asked me to, I said, well, the only way for us to do a serious plan for Tobago is to bring everybody into the process. They didn't want to do that. The fear of democracy, in my view, is the reason we are where we are today. And that fear has to be dealt with by the population. We have to demand as a people that no government should operate the way Fali and his government is operating.
All right, and I think that's a good point to leave this conversation on. I want to thank you so much, Dr. James, for being on with us and for giving us your perspectives. And it leaves me thinking a little bit about that CDP plan that was there that never really got to put into place. But hey, that's a conversation for another day.
Created by an expert, that can't work.
Yes. Anyways, viewers, thank you for being with us, and I hope you have a safe and wonderful day, and we will see you again tomorrow.
Hey. Tobago updates.